Well, thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to see some friends. I'm a little daunted by this because my background is not closely connected to public policy of this sort. I'm an ethnographer and a depth interviewer by training. This is a book that tries to draw out the experiences that we have in dealing face-to-face with people about issues of cooperation. One thing we could accomplish in this seminar is you could educate me about whether this has any relevance. But looking back on it now, there was one very strong connection between the world that I knew as a performer and the world that's documented in this book, and that is the necessity of cooperation for people to do things together. I've been interested throughout the book in what people who are not supposed experts on issues of negotiation, cooperation, conflict management, and so on, actually know about these issues without knowing that they know it. The focus of the introduction of the book is really on the issue of dialogic cooperation. The second chapter of the book looks at the relation between cooperation and competition, really from a materialist point of view. I'm very interested in what ethologists and biologists know about the relation between competition and cooperation in natural communities, and I asked whether that understanding of the understanding of natural cooperation help us in understanding human patterns of cooperation. My argument is that basically the kind of unsettling cooperation that occurred at the dawn of the modern era with the Protestant Reformation had the effect of opening up both possibilities and creating issues of how to cooperate, which remained 4 centuries later at the end of modernity unresolved.
But this phrase tribalism caught my ear, and in the introduction you are playing also with the themes of the stranger, the foreigner. You're juxtaposing Simmel to Robert Putnam, and clearly there is a question here. My first question will be, do we have anything to juxtapose to tribalism? Or isn't tribalism itself rather part of a phenomena of hybridity, creolization? What is this dialectic between tribalism and globalization? Why isn't there something like a cosmopolitan ethic that emerges? Now, there are 2 categories. We play with the concepts of sympathy and empathy. I mean, if there's going to be any kind of bite also to a sense of interdependence as an ethical project, I must be able to empathize with that young man on the streets of Cairo who's having his head bashed, and if I'm going to understand what really is going on there. But what is the distinction that you are working towards between sympathy and empathy?
The democratic dilemma, which is Rousseauist, which you recognize, is that democracy depends on a form of community, common ground, and solidarity among citizens that allows them to adjudicate conflicts. Historically, solidarity turns out to be a key premise of democratic life. Now that leads directly into the fundamental issue for me. If the premise of democratic life is a kind of commonality, common ground, solidarity, clearly as you extend the compass of the polity, you get thinner and thinner forms of connections, and in a way the fundamental problem of democracy has always been that the broader its compass, the thinner the hold on its citizens. Average people want to see white Catholics or black Baptists just like them when they sit down to make peace with one another.
It isn't from the sociologist's point of view a question about difference. It's a question about social skill, and that skill is situated in everyday behavior.
Now, you'll notice if you watch this literature from Franz de Waal, the primatologist, The Age of Empathy, and he says all of our assumptions about human nature have to be questioned in the light of new evidence. Think about Damasio. The mistake is that what researchers are finding across the human sciences is that by nature, what distinguishes us as a species is our capacity for empathy and mutual understanding. We are born with the rudiments of the desire and ability to cooperate with others. So that to create the very structures that you're talking about that stand in the way of cooperation, you need to have basically a kind of initiation that breaks these human capacities, that creates the tribalism.
I make a distinction between sympathy and empathy in this book. I think that mutual understanding is one of those cliches that leads people in the social sciences way, way astray. Empathy is not an act of identification. Sympathy is an act of identification. The idea of empathy in Arendt's work is rather the notion that we ought to find out what the other is on about, accepting the fact that you may not understand it, but that it's vital to know. What that means is that social distance, if people learn to negotiate it, has got a positive value. Identification is, in a way, a great bar to practicing complex forms of cooperation.
If I can translate, the revolution in the human sciences, in the past development of psychologists focused on sympathy, now the focus is on empathy, which is exactly what you were describing. From the beginning, we have a capacity not to identify, but to, in other words, just to pick them up, to know them, to register them in our bodies. But if you talk about gender, we deal with difference all the time. And we don't have tribes of men and women. So the idea that difference is foreign to our nature or something we only encounter when we meet another tribe really overlooks the fact that we're dealing with difference all the time.
And I think that the dilemma is that it is incumbent upon us also to explain, number one, why does the capacity for empathy, why does it disappear under certain social political circumstances? We have to come to the present, because what we are capable of at the species level obviously does not translate into, quotidian politics, and so we have to sort of bridge that gap. Jackie?
For me, the tribes are the different cultures that exist, and I didn't think of it as difference as you have described. It wasn't. But I thought back to a period of time in the artistic community that at a point during the 80s, we all started talking about multiculturalism. And within the artistic community and within what we saw as our obligation, we began to work differently. Everyone took the responsibility of saying, we need to help the cultures that exist within our communities celebrate their culture, distinguish between who they are and who the others are. I started wondering as I was reading through this, did we do a bad thing? Because what ended up happening is that we created silos, a different way of communicating the performing arts and bringing along community to understand their own roots. By doing so, these communities became stronger within themselves, and they certainly created the silos that did not any longer communicate with each other in the same way. It's just a point I want to make about tribalism.
Let's take a Bosnian who was empathizing with a Serb around about 1997. Well, if he did that right, the message might be that person wants to murderously kill me. That would be, and that would also, in a certain way, be mutual understanding. In other words, that person would be correctly understanding the other person. So my point is that isn't empathy of use at the end of the day, only if it does really lead finally to sympathy.
As species beings, we may have certain capacities, but there is this intermediation that we call culture, society, etc. And so to me, growing up in Latin America, politically, empathy was a second-rate disposition. In fact, solidarity was that which could overcome your distaste, your enmity, etc., of the other. With empathy, you would not get there. Your musicians group, that form of cooperation, I project that onto a global scale, which is marked by a distributed condition, where each specificity can be maintained, right? The difference, the violin, the piano, blah, blah. And yet, it constitutes a structure. So maybe it's not closed, etc. But you know, this notion that you are part of, even as you are different.
A lot of well-meaning social theory looks at cooperation as a kind of end in itself. It's a tool. The tool that is used for action between people. And if you know how to use the tool well, you'll be able to act well in some ways. But it doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be something which is self-sufficing because you're skilled in it. A lot of social theory, awareness of the other is equated with sympathy. And empathy is seen as the emotional coloration. This was a big issue in pragmatism, and particularly for John Dewey, who founded a school founded on the assumption that you had to feel what it's like to be a worker in order to be able to represent the rights of workers politically. Led pragmatism into a touchy-feely direction, increasingly touchy-feely direction. That is, that pragmatic action is the same thing as this kind of touchy-feely understanding. Just make a final comment about multiculturalism and the silos. To me, what's interesting about this is the idea of culture that's embodied in multiculturalism. It is knowing your center rather than feeling what's ambiguous at your edge.
It's useful to think who is obligated to develop that skill versus others who are not. And I mean, my research is the interaction between poor lower caste golf caddies in India with wealthy upper caste members of private exclusive golf clubs. And in my experience studying them, it is the caddies who have to develop and practice that skill of cooperation because of their diminished power and disadvantage versus the wealthy members who do not, who sort of have this privilege of not having to be cooperative.
To come back to the political and power issue and thus back to democracy. The democratic paradox is precisely the democratic frames allow us empathy, reciprocity, negotiation, and all those things. And often the problem is not the absence of empathy, but the absence of democracy across borders. The problem with global governance is not just extending empathy to others, but also in extending democratic governance in a way that includes people so that we are all, if you like, equal. Logically, empathy and sympathy are two versions of exactly the same thing.
In German, there is this whole discussion in the 19th century between Einfühlung, Mitfühlung, and the whole theory that comes with Scheler afterwards about empathy and sympathy. And these differentiations are made because Mitgefühl is to feel with, and Einfühlung is to be able to feel inside somebody. And then this is a big issue in Hillside. All historical understanding is supposed to be based upon Einfühlung, your capacity to go into the head of someone.
Right. Patrick's point, who needs this? And the reason they need it is that they need to restore those informal networks of association which are being weakened by forces of modern capitalism. To me, where all this leads is to how to find skills of empowerment which are un-Obama-like. To me, as a politician, he is a disempowering figure certainly for the unemployed, and I think for other disadvantaged groups in America. So that's where I come out of this.
Thank you all. I think most richly in this discussion is how it is emblematic of what we're doing here. And I want to emphasize again, and I hope you all will continue to come. This is a continuing workshop. I can't tell you how valuable it is that some of you have found the time, and I hope all of you will try to make the time. It's only once a month, and I think it's so tremendously valuable, and for that reason I particularly appreciate from Virginia, who has now been twice deferred, and we're so glad that now she's going to have a chance to talk with us in this continuing dialogue.